welcome to the Before the War podcast. My name is Ella McFarland, and this is the first intro episode into my new podcast. I am so excited to be here on this journey with you all. I want this to be an episode where not only am I giving a little bit of background information on who I am and what I hope to accomplish in this new podcast series, and what I plan to uncover in the next few weeks and months, but I want this to be an episode that really sets up the rest of the series and just provides that level of detail to apply to listening to all the other episodes. Some of you may know me from my other podcast, Highly Inspired, which I did for, I want to say 3 years, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less. And while I'm really sad that that chapter is closed for the time being, I'm so excited to start this new series with you all. As I'm sure a lot of you who were on my podcast journey prior to this this new series knew that the last few years have been so crazy. So much has happened, not only in my life, but just in the world in general. And I really think this has been such a time of awakening, of spiritual recognition, of really reconnecting back to nature and the physical world and what we're designed to do, as not just with our bodies, but also with our spirit and with our minds, and just what the human experience is meant to entail. I know me personally, that has just, ever since 2020, that's just been where my head is at, and it's been a slow but steady progression to where I am now. And I have completely done a 180 in so many areas, but I've also reconnected to roots and deep down values that I had instilled to me at a young age that just maybe were suppressed for a really long time, or just weren't manifested yet into who I have become as an adult. That being said, I just kind of hope, at a very high level, I just want to kind of put out there what I want this episode to be. I want this to be walking through my story and how I went from being this 19-year-old college student with dreams of moving to a big city like New York or LA, and having kind of a more corporate career in finance or corporate real estate, which is what I was studying at the time. Kids were not really at the forefront of my mind. I honestly thought that could be something, I'm kind of I tend to be kind of selfish with my time. And obviously when you have kids, it's they become the priority, as they should. So that was something that was just kind of on the back burner for me. I really, I mean, this kind of is an example that I think speaks to a lot of things that I've done a 180 on. But at the time, I, believed things like, it was probably a good idea that we got into the Iraq War, or the Patriot Act is meant to protect us, or George Bush probably isn't a bad guy. And that's just a very small example, but I think that if you're catching on to that wavelength, it speaks to a larger representation of things that I kind of took as Bible, growing up around the corporate media and stuff, and then with social media and YouTube and alternative media, that kind of shattering some of those narratives and exposing me to another side of history, another perspective that I was just completely sheltered from, that really caused me to unschool on a lot of that historical knowledge, but also health knowledge, science knowledge, the list goes on. So that's kind of in a nutshell who I was as a 19-year-old, leading up to 2020 when 2020 happened. And then since then, now I'm 24. So 3 to 4 years later, I am a young mom to my son. I am back in my hometown. I'm working with family in a small business environment. I did a natural birth with a midwife. So that was definitely like a 180 from not even knowing how kids fit into my future. I definitely now am very skeptical of the 9/11 official narrative. And I have a lot of questions about things like Tower 7. I definitely now don't think it was a good idea to go into the Iraq War, and I've become definitely an isolationist in that respect. I also have become more just into naturopathic medicine and holistic healing. And I'm just way more open to the nuances of the world and life and what is true than I was when I was younger. I still, if anything, now I'm more committed to objective truth and finding objective truth, believing objective truth, committing myself to that as a way of morality, but in the sense of like I'm so stuck cold to certain things of how I thought about the world. I've become way more open and just kind of learn to surrender. Like, hey, I know nothing. I'm on this journey and I am open to hearing all different types of perspectives, even with things that I thought were so solidified, like history or science, where they're actually, if you're just listening to one source, you're not going to get the full picture there. So, yeah, and I guess to kind of sum all of that up, kind of that contrast between my 19-year-old self and my current self, I would say the biggest difference is that I am no longer what you would call, I guess, a normie, which I guess that phrase has been kind of conned to just mean someone that is going through the motions, that's stuck maybe kind of in this hamster wheel of consumerism and materialism and kind of even a little bit can become narcissistic where you're just, it's all me, and I am good with whatever is the next current thing, and I'm just putting that on as kind of my secular religion, whether that be supporting the Ukraine war or wanting everyone to get vaccinated even when they don't want to, or just kind of wanting that draconian set of morality that is being pushed upon you from kind of a higher entity such as like the government or the World Economic Forum or something like that. So I've definitely broken away from being like a normie. I've definitely have embraced this more questioning, skeptical, independent thinking mindset, and not just like having it internally, but also not being afraid to express it externally in the proper environment and setting. Because I think that's also really important. When you keep all of your beliefs to yourself, eventually you stop being the manifestation of those beliefs externally, and you will create a sever between what you believe internally and what you're externally practicing in your everyday life by your actions. And I guess kind of getting into a little bit more detail into my story, and the biggest reason why I want to do this podcast is because when I stopped being a normie and became more open, I also realized that we were in this war. We were in this information war. We were in this physical war in some sense. We were in this biological war. We were in all these different kind of wars that you can't really identify who the real enemy is. It's not as clear. It didn't feel as clear as like World War II or something that you're having. It's a very set. Oh, this side against this side, and even not to go down a rabbit hole right now, but even World War II, it wasn't. There's still so much denseness and sketchy stuff that happened. Like, for example, we took a lot of Nazis back to the U.S. into like science programs after the war, but that's a podcast for another day. But anyways, where I was going with that is that things right now, there's a lot of confusion It's really hard to identify like who is the enemy, who's your friend, what is right, what is wrong. I think before 2020, and now it's getting a little bit easier, but before 2020 it was definitely really hard. And I think the reason why that is because life in the US was, and just in the Western world in general, it had gotten so convenient, so easy, so many options, so free, so little threat from external factors such as like an invasion from a foreign country, or even there's not a lot of like predators. A lot of us live in cities or houses with locks and doors, so it's like you're not getting attacked in the wild by a bear. So kind of this, and that's not to say that people don't struggle in the US and aren't struggling. They are, and I totally have become more aware of the economic and other personal struggles that people like have in this country. But I think just overall, we have had things have been pretty sophisticated, and because things have been so sophisticated, evil and darkness has kind of taken a back step and become more hidden and more discreet. And that doesn't mean that it's still not as present as it was maybe thousands of years ago or hundreds of years ago or whatever. It just means that it's not as overt as I think it once was. So it's harder to really identify who the enemy is, what evil is, what is right or wrong. Everything just kind of becomes this subjective moralism, which kind of in high school and in college, I realized that a lot of the people that were like in my community and just kind of the general mindset was that things were just kind of this subjective moralism. And there was just kind of these blanket statements of, well, as long as you're a good person, that's fine. But without defining like what it means to be a good person, or you're a good person as long as you're not, or I believe anyone can do whatever they want as long as you're not hurting anyone. And it's like, okay, well, what does hurting anyone mean? And like how wide or how narrow is the scope of that? Something really, for example, that can be confusing is something like, I don't know, that's up for debate is like pornography, or even a step further in saying like being a prostitute. Like technically being a prostitute in the US is illegal, and the case for it being legal is that, well, you should be able to do whatever you want with your body. Who is the government to step in and say you shouldn't be able to do that? And for me, someone who, especially in college, and I still do hold a lot of these values, I would say I became a lot more like libertarian, and it's like hard to know like where that political belief system and then that personal belief system, where that crosses with something like pornography or prostitution, because it's like, okay, yeah, I guess everyone should be able to. It's like, okay, is prostitution like hurting someone? It's not hurting someone in the same way maybe as murdering someone, but it's still hurting. It's hurting the person that's using the woman or the man for prostitution, and it's hurting the receiving person as well, because it's not having like sexual relationships in a healthy, committed relationship that is bearing good fruit ultimately. So yeah, not to get into like the weeds on different things, but that was just kind of where I was at in life. I just think because things were relatively good, I wasn't being bombarded with a lot of overt good versus evil moral decision making, that I fell into this very secular, subjective, go with the flow kind of spiritual and just overall moral thinking. And it was so different from what I grew up with. I grew up Catholic. I went to Catholic school my whole life. And this isn't going to be a podcast about religion, although religion might come up here and there, because I think it's really hard to separate. You can't separate someone's identity to what they're talking about. It's going to come up. But I think for me, I never went through a period where I was like, I reject this. I reject the idea of God. I reject the idea of heaven and hell. I reject even the idea of Catholicism and the sacraments and all this stuff. But I kind of wanted to make this like deal in my head of, okay, I'm gonna in my head still like believe all these things, and I still want to, end my life with this relationship with God, and like I want to be a good person, but I don't want to be specific about that, and I don't want to be overt about that, and I just kind of want to blend in, and I want to live my life. I want to have fun, and I want to be carefree, and I don't really want to work on developing my spiritual life. Wasn't spending a ton of time in prayer, definitely wasn't prioritizing it. And without getting into all the nitty gritty of what I was doing or how I fell away, but I was definitely fallen away for several years. But it was never this, I don't think this is true, or I don't believe this like in the back of my head. It was just something that I had suppressed so much because I hadn't really had to deal with it in a transformational way, and I wasn't prioritizing enough to make it my first priority, so therefore it just wasn't how I was viewing life. And then when COVID happened, it started to present these really clear, objective moral questions that previously I just kind of left up to subjectivity. And I think the first one that really started to pop up was lockdowns. And I just knew, it wasn't just that I knew in my heart that it was wrong. In the real physical world, it also was wrong. It was very clear after 2 months that what we were being told was inaccurate, and it was causing more damage than good. And I feel very blessed that the last 3 years, I feel like I was put in the right place at the right time in a lot of situations that allowed me to have my eyes open more so than maybe other people were. Maybe other people were in different places or whatever. But when COVID happened, I was in Europe and I was studying abroad there, and I got sent home immediately. And within 24 hours, like I had to pack everything up and just go. I didn't get to say goodbye to anyone. I just had to go back to the US. And when I was in London, I got to see how people they were making fun of Americans for taking it too seriously. They were really thinking it was the flu, and their people and their schools and everything, like they were not planning on closing down. They thought that was like ridiculous. And then when I got to the US, I was being told the exact opposite. I was being told, we need to lock down. Europe's already locked down. All these countries think, we're so behind. And I was like, wait a second, like I was in California. That was one of the first places to shut down. I mean, Italy did shut down, but that was a pretty close second. So I was like, okay, this is weird. And then I am in California. I jumped to Arizona, which is where I live, where I'm from, where I live. I was traveling after a week of being in California, went to Arizona. And I remember when I first got back to California with my friends too, a lot of my college friends, like people were like, this is so exciting. Like school's off. Like, oh, thank goodness this isn't hurting anyone like our age. Like this is just a very like small demographic of people that are actually dying from this. Like we don't need to worry. And it was so crazy to see like once everyone got home and was isolated, and by isolated, I mean like you just were only talking to the people that were in either your apartment, so maybe that was just you, or talking to your immediate family. And but what everyone had in common was everyone had that TV on. Everyone had that CNN, that Fox News. But anyways, like everyone had their news channels on, right? And we were all listening to the exact same narrative, and we were allowing our minds to get all synced up. And it was in that moment, in those first few weeks, that I realized, okay, what I'm being told on TV is different than what I experienced in Europe, what I experienced talking to people in real life. And luckily, being in Arizona, I was in a state that, even though we were shut down for a few months, we pushed back on our governor to open things up, and it was. I pretty early on saw this. This is a organized effort to shut down the world. And at this point, I don't think I really exactly knew why. I just knew that was what was going on. And I also was able to look at the data very objectively and be like, look, it is not people that are, it's people with comorbidities that are dying. COVID itself is not the thing that's killing people. This is probably the same mortality rate as like the flu. And so then I became kind of angry that we were still shut down. I didn't know why. I was so confused. I didn't know what was going on. And yeah, so that was kind of like my first thing of being like, okay, this is objectively right and this is objectively wrong. And I don't want to see small businesses shut down. I don't want to see a major transfer of wealth happen where the top 1%, and I use that terminology lightly, but the top 1% and the top corporations are gaining all of this wealth and momentum. Individual landlords are losing their properties to big corporations like BlackRock. The list goes on. You get my drift. So I that was kind of like phase one. And then phase two obviously was the whole COVID pokey situation. And I sorry, I shouldn't be laughing, but I instinctually knew that I heard the word mRNA and I was like, I don't know what that is, but I don't want any part of it. And it just sounds kind of like transhumanism in a way. It just doesn't sound natural. And I, at this point, was still, I wasn't like on the full naturopath, home birth, like heal yourself kick that I'm on now. But I definitely, I was raised to know the difference between organic and, choose like spending a little bit more extra money on getting food that is locally sourced and that doesn't have chemicals and preservatives in it. And, just that type that type of stuff. And also prior to this, I had just gone through this like crazy immune system collapse that happened during college when I first got there because of mold exposure, which that's a whole nother story in and of itself. But so I was just like kind of the seeds had already been planted for my rejection of the COVID vaccine. And then when it got to the point of, oh, you're going to lose your job if you get this vaccine, you're going to be kicked out of school, you're going to be isolated from your friends, from your family, you're going to be disinvited to Thanksgiving. I said, this is completely unacceptable. And I think that maybe that's when I started to kind of reconnect to my faith and my spirituality and what the values that had been installed in me from a young age, because it's like, okay, you don't discriminate. And it doesn't matter what that discrimination is, if it has to do with race, age, nationality, vaccination status, but you just do not do that. Like that's not okay, especially when it was very clear early on that this vaccine was basically ineffective. So I went to New York and like protested the mandates. I met all these like amazing, cool people. A lot of them weren't conservatives. A lot of them were liberal, or, were more artistic. Yeah, so it was a really cool experience to be able to go to New York City when the state was closed to those that were unvaccinated. Like you couldn't go, like the protesters, like we couldn't go into a bathroom in the city. It was a such a cool, crazy experience. And I just went back to New York recently post that. So it was interesting to kind of see the comparison there. So yeah, like during that time I was juggling between California, Arizona, Texas, and I was just seeing all the different, and while some people were just still stuck in their homes. And so being able to travel, being able to talk to different people, see where different people were at, gave me that perspective of, okay, like we are not, like, we need to just throw everything that we're hearing out the window. And yeah, so that definitely like played a role in my whole like awakening experience. I would say too, in the last 3 years, I really realized, okay, we're in this information war. We're starting to uncover that the enemy is the modern world that we've kind of bought into, our corporate government, the larger plan for globalization, corporatization, you shall own nothing and you shall be happy, depopulation, those kind of World Economic Forum agendas. And I remember the first time that I found out about what the World Economic Forum was, what the Great Reset was. I remember Jordan and I did a podcast episode on that fall of 2020. So this is like right around the election. And I bought the book and I started reading it and skimming it. And I was in a depression for several days. I was crying. I was angry. I was upset. I was distraught. And although I had started to see the evil that had happened with COVID, I had started to be able to identify the good versus the bad, the objective truth, like I just kind of laid out. It was really this moment that I think it was the election with this compounding, and I was just so distraught, and I was like, what is this world? Like, what is this evil? Like, how are we going to win? How are we going to win? Like, this is a huge battle and no one's awake to this. No one knows what's going on. And this was before, people like Tucker Carlson and Russell Brand and et cetera were really like talking about this and sounding the alarm. So I feel a lot better now. But at the time it was still so unknown. And then I was like, okay, this all makes sense. This makes sense what happened with COVID. This makes sense what happened with the vaccine. This makes sense what happened with globalism, like climate change. Like all this makes sense, and all the dots were connected. And it's like, okay, what do I do with this information? And I went kind of into this like prophet, this prophet kind of place where I was like, do I just like proclaim this to people? I don't know what to do. I don't want to sound weird. But I feel like people have to know, and there was a million things like this that kind of put me into this cycle. It wasn't just the Great Reset. It was finding out about the Rockefellers. It was finding about our healthcare system being a sick care system. It was about finding out about 9/11. It was about finding out about JFK, MK Ultra, the Federal Reserve, Epstein's Island, the aggressive 70 Pokey Pokies schedule that is mandated by most pediatricians' office in the U.S. and how more aggressive that was than even any Western country. It was finding out about birth and the birthing industry complex, and that it's meant to just make money, and it inadvertently causes a lot of birth trauma and a lot of unnecessary C-sections. It was finding out about mother mortality rate is the highest in the U.S. of all the developed countries. It was about finding out that motherhood is not enslavement, that there is a scam associated with materialism that is making us focus on the wrong things, whether that be focusing on the wedding itself, the wedding ring versus the marriage, whether it be focusing on the perfect nursery, the perfect maternity photo shoot, the perfect baby shower versus the actual birth of the child, preparing for that, and then preparing for motherhood, figuring out, learning and mentally preparing to be the best mother you can possibly can be. And then, yeah, just all these things, so many things, and the list goes on, right? And so each time that I learned about one of these things, and I got to the root and the truth of it, I threw myself into this cycle of, okay, first of all, this doesn't make sense. Something would spark my interest. For example, birth. It doesn't make. I heard on a podcast that a lot of women were getting in the epidurals there was fentanyl, and I go, what? That doesn't make sense. And then I do a deep dive, and then I'm like, oh my gosh, I've 180'd. I've 180'd on everything that I thought that I knew, and I don't know anything. And now I know this. What do I do with that information? And then it would get me in this state of scared, being sad, being angry, exhausted, helpless, just very emotional, right? And then it got to this place of, okay, what do I do now that I know what I know? And that was one of the hardest steps to get through, because when I first got through the COVID stuff, the election, Great Reset, I was really down, because it was kind of like three things hit me all at once in a very short time frame. And I was just around people that were just so clueless, and I loved them so much, but I just didn't know how to I didn't know how to become normal again. And I just remember one of my friends saying, either you need to do something about this, or you need to not let it affect you so much and make you go insane, because you can only control what your actions are. You cannot control the entire outcome of the world. And I think that speaks to a greater theological truth, which is, at the end of the day, all you can control is your own holiness, your own decisions, your own, salvation and spiritual life. You can't impose that on other people. That has to be a direct relationship between them and God and the Creator. You can't intercede for that. I mean, for your kids, you can help foster that, but at a certain point, they're going to be 18, and they have to claim that as their own, just like I had to claim that as my own. And I even had to go through a period of kind of separation. And so yeah, so kind of step 5, where you're like, okay, then you're going, what actions can I take? And that's what I want this podcast to be about. I don't want this podcast just be about the uncovering and my storytelling, but I want it to be about actions and about how I can take this information that I learned and then make real life incremental changes that are going to better my life and better how I feel and how I do things. Because what's the point of learning something if you're not going to make decisions based off of that, right? So for example, I even though I grew up around real estate, I was studying real estate, I had most of my internship experience in real estate, I was so disconnected from how great of an investment buying your first property is, how much you should prioritize that, how much financial freedom that could bring. I really was kind of I liked the idea of renting and the freedom that brought. And I think so that, for example, that's an actionable step that I took. I bought my first piece of real estate this year, and it's obviously comes with more headaches than anticipated, but ultimately I think it's going to be a good thing, and it's going to allow me to be more financially independent, which works against the bigger goal of how do I tackle this big entity like the World Economic Forum that wants me to own nothing and be happy and rent for life. Okay, I bought a condo. Yeah, that's small. That's not a 500-acre ranch. I'm not growing my own food yet, and I'm not homesteading, even though maybe that's something I'd be interested later down the road, maybe not. But I made the first step in kind of giving the middle finger to this global institution that has brought me so much fear and kind of emotional pain in the past, and I've been able to do something about it, even though it's small. And then I think the final step for me in this kind of cycle, this 5 to 6 step cycle, is just finding peace. This one has been the hardest and the longest to figure out, but finding comfort in the fact that I know nothing, that I could do all the research on something and do all the unschooling and all the unlearning and relearning. But at the end of the day, especially if I didn't experience it, I just don't know. Like there's going to be this mystery element component to it. And just kind of finding trust and faith in the unknown and just being like, okay, I don't know that, but I do the one thing that I can count on is my relationship with God, and that's if I have that, then I'm going to be okay. So just kind of being able to always go back to that place, and even if you don't believe in God, just having this overall mindset of surrendering the circumstances to the greater good. I think it's I think that's kind of the final step to kind of get yourself out of that like emotional, scared place when you're uncovering some of these crazy things. And so again, I want this podcast to be a place where we're uncovering that stuff, but we're allowing ourselves to be in our emotions, but we're also coming up with actionable steps that are going to make us feel better, and then ultimately ending in that state of surrender and peace, that whatever happens is going to happen, and we can't control every element of it, and a lot of us want to, but we just can't. And so kind of going back to how I ended up where I am now, a big part of that was my son, and he was this unexpected thing that happened to me when I found out I was pregnant with him. And I've talked about this on Highly Inspired, and I talked about this in another video about my birth story, so I won't get into it. But I am so grateful that I got that opportunity in life to really just fully jolt. That was like the final jolt that woke me up, and that was like, okay, Ella, who do you want to be? This is it. This is the time to be a grown up and really solidify like what your values are and what you want for your life. And 9 months later, I've had my son, and he has taught me more than I could ever teach myself, which is crazy because he's just a baby. He's just a baby. He's the best, but it, he is so much smarter than so many of us in so many different ways. Not smarter, but just he's more in tune with nature and with what calms us as humans, what is good for our souls, what's good for our bodies, what makes us happy, what doesn't. And I want to do one of my first podcasts on that, but I don't remember where I was going with this. But anyways, he was the final solidifying factor into my 180 journey, and I'm sure he will continue to be the number one person at this point in my life that is bringing me closer to the truth and forcing me to investigate things and dig to the bottom, and then ultimately figure out how to react to that and make decisions and take action and ultimately find peace. So that being said, I think that about covers what I wanted to do in this podcast episode on a very high level. And I am so excited to continue this season with you guys, go on this journey. And I think it's just closing thoughts. It's really important to remind yourselves that there's nothing new under the sun. There's always been this battle of good and evil, this war that has been going on. We just had a time period before the war that we were a little bit oblivious to it, especially here in the U.S., especially in more Western developed countries, where, problems might not be that overt in that way. And I think 2020 and the last few years, as tough as they've been, I think financially, emotionally, spiritually, with, just obviously like inflation, rent increases, the deaths of COVID and the injuries of the pokey rollout, all that stuff, all of the above, the culture war, the elections, the insecurity of our elections, all that stuff that's caused chaos. I think that we've been given a gift, and it's an opportunity to reflect, try to figure out what's going on, try to discern the truth the best we can, and then make decisions, take action, even if they're small, and then surrender and live our lives and be happy, and be joyful. And yeah, so thank you and have a great rest of your day and your week. Bye, everyone.